Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education here at Winebow. We invite you to place any and all questions or comments in the Q&A, as we will not be managing the chat window. And today is one of those days where we're going to really want you to have some comments in the Q&A, because we're going to have some discussion questions towards the end of this webinar. Let me introduce your host, Certified Bordeaux Educator, TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys the privilege of doing what he loves full time. And now, here to discuss today's topic, the families of Bordeaux, the 1855 classification, TJ Griffin. Hey, TJ.
Hey, Ron, how are you?
I'm doing well. You know, I should probably mention right now that there's been a few episodes where people have suddenly been hearing extra voices in their heads. And while we cannot always explain that, it might just be that you need to close the YouTube window that's popped up on your browser. So all of you out in the audience, just double check that your YouTube browser didn't automatically open and start playing a previous episode of the Bordeaux Show.
Yes, that's a good point. So people don't, but if you are hearing other voices besides ours in your head, we can't help you.
Yes.
You should go see a professional.
Yes, seek other professional advice besides wine.
Yeah, we can help you with this, but we can't help you with that. So yeah, we're going to talk about, this has been a long time coming, but we're finally moved all through Bordeaux. We've talked about all the appellations. And now we're going to talk about the classification, starting with the big one, the 1855 classification. So there's a little poster for that. So this is, it's amazing because it's still in place today. It's still very influential. It's the most organized, the most influential wine, classification of a region probably ever, and probably ever will be at this point too. So it's really a fascinating thing, and we could probably talk for hours about this, but we won't. We're going to keep it brief because I want to get to the discussion. But we're all familiar with this to some extent. Maybe you don't know all the chateau. I certainly don't. But you've heard of first gross, second gross. You've heard of Grand Cru or something like that. You've heard of Lafite Rothschild or Aubryon or something. Everyone who's a wine drinker who's ever dabbled in Bordeaux has some sort of inkling about what this classification is. So we're really going to dive deep into it and then discuss some opinions. So how did we get here? That's the question. Where did this classification come from? A lot of people know part of the story. They don't know the whole story. Not that I'm saying I do, but I have a good grasp on how we came to this point. And we're going to have to go beyond before 1855. We're going to go back in history here. We're going to talk about this gentleman, Napoléon III. He was actually Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and he was an emperor of France, and then became the first president of France. And he was very forward-thinking. He really wanted to get France back on the map, so to speak. He wanted to have France become a major power again and influence Europe. He modernized infrastructure. He modernized the economy. He was always looking for ways to promote France. So he was watching when he saw what the Brits were doing, which is this. This is a painting of the London's Great Exhibition of 1851, which the full original name is the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. And this came about because in the 18th century, so prior to this, there were national fairs in England, and they were sort of like trade shows, but there was a carnival-like atmosphere to them. They were for public entertainment, so a lot of fun to go to and view. And what happened was Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was also quite a forward-thinking man, and he saw that the potential for an exhibition of Britain and all its industries and commodities would help the economy in England. excuse me, he wanted to get an international audience going. So what he did was organize this, the London's Great Exhibition of 1851, which was also called the Crystal Palace. It was hosted in Hyde Park, and it was a big deal. It helped sales, it expanded industry in England, and the French took notice. Napoleon III took notice, and he said, we should do something like that, and we should do it better. We should have it bigger and better. And they came up with this, the Exposition Universelle in 1855. And this was huge. This was a much larger space. It included more countries than the Crystal Palace. It had reduced admission prices and a separate fine arts pavilion, which you can see a drawing of in the upper left there. That was the Beaux-Arts. So a lot of the famous artists of the day from all over, not just France, were exhibiting there. So it 5,000 works by artists from 29 countries. It lost money, but it was such a positive impact on the future economy that they had a series of them afterwards. So it was really a big deal. As part of this, Napoleon asked the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce if they could arrange an exhibit of the best wines of the time, because France was, of course, known for wine. So this is not, Ron, I disclaimer, this is not the actual Bordeaux in France Chamber of Commerce. This is Bordeaux Nashville Chamber.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out, is that Nashville? And what part of Bordeaux is that in, or that's in a part of France I obviously haven't been to.
Yeah, so I couldn't find the original Chamber of Commerce logo, but this popped up, and I like it. I like the color. They did a good job on this, and I did not know. I don't know if you knew this. Did you know there was a Bordeaux in Nashville?
I did not. I know there is a lot of Bordeaux in Nashville based on collectors that live there and the money that resides there, but I did not know there was a Bordeaux North.
I had no idea. So check it out, I guess, someday. I've been to Memphis, but I have yet to go to Nashville. But so they asked the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce sort of passed the buck to the Syndicat des Courtiers of Bordeaux, the syndicate of the Courtiers. They're basically the merchants, the forerunners of today's negotiations and brokers. If they could handle this, so they said, sure. You know, they knew what they were doing. They knew the industry, and it actually didn't take them very long to come up with a list. And this list, you know, was basically what we have today. But they knew that it was going to be controversial. They said at the time, it's a quote, "You know as well as we do, sirs, that this classification is a delicate task and bound to raise questions. Remember that we have not tried to create an official ranking, but only to offer you a sketch drawn from the very best sources." So they're already having a disclaimer before it's even out, Ron, that, you know, this is not a ranking. Of course, it became one, but the original intent was to give you sort of an idea of what some of the best wines are. But
when I was reading through the notes and I was thinking, wow, the time frame that they took to come to this decision, I think it says a few things I think it's worth dwelling on for a moment. Well,
sure.
When you said it didn't take very long, how long did it take?
It was about 2 weeks from when they were asked to do it to when they presented the list.
All right. So in 2 weeks, now there are fewer properties in 1855 than now. So we have to scale down a little bit, but it was still a big wine region with a lot of properties. In 2 weeks, they sat down and just immediately made their list. Boom. These are the best wines.
Mm-hmm.
That says a lot, actually, in and of itself, don't you think? It's like they didn't have to mull it over for 3 months to figure out who the best properties were. And I think that it speaks to its validity going forward, that they were able to come up with it so quickly, and that it didn't meet as much resistance as it would have if it wasn't pretty true.
Right. Yeah. And I think it also speaks to, you know, they didn't have to sit down, get all the wines together, do a blind tasting, you know, compare notes and blah, blah, blah. Everyone knew in the industry what the best wines were, what the best chateau were. This history goes way back before the 1855 classification. Thomas Jefferson did his own classification system and he picked, as his best wines became, were the first growths, what became the first growths. So these were well known for decades. I wouldn't say centuries, but maybe going back over 100 years of what the best chateaux were. So they were well known. So it didn't take them, I suspect, Ron, I don't know what your opinion is, but I suspect they started to quit. The reason it took them 2 weeks instead of a few days or a week was when they started to get down into the third, fourth, and what became the fifth gross. Well, I don't know, is that fourth or is that fifth? That's where I would find the shading more difficult. What do you think?
Agreed. Yeah, because once it's usually pretty easy in any subject matter to like get your top 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it becomes shades of gray and like 2/3 majority vote kind of situation instead of like unanimous decisions.
And they were under some time pressure as well. They didn't have a year to do this, or even several months. They had to get it done. But you're right. It speaks to the validity of it. Speaks to everyone sort of acknowledged it. There was some, disagreement. This is a reproduction of the original lists, and we're just gonna go through the list real quickly here. So just take notes. It's this. There you go. There we go. There it goes. I hope everyone's writing these down. Yep. Okay. So that's that. That's an attempt at
I just memorized them while they were scrolling.
Yeah, you did. Wow. Do you have one of those photographic memories that you can just look?
No, I have one of those non-photographic memories that wishes it was photographic.
Well, we don't need to go through each and every chateau. You can look those up on your own at any point. There's just Google 1855 classification, and about 6,000 websites come up. But there was some controversy. One of the things that happened, and I didn't know this, Ron, until I did the research for this. I did know that Mouton Rothschild was not classified as a premier cru. It was classified as deuxième cru. So you can see, I believe, yes, if you look on the left, it's hard to make out because it's script and it's kind of faint, but it was placed at the top of the second growths. And everyone sort of acknowledged that Mouton was a great wine. And it was inferred that meant it was the best of the seconds. So they had to come back and say, no. Once we're in the crus, these are not ranked. And then they did it, I believe they did it alphabetical after that. But at first, people assumed that the list within each cru was a ranking in and of itself, and that was a mistake. Another mistake that was made was Chateau Cantemerle was left off by accident. They meant to put it in, and they forgot, and it was added in 1856. But really, in 160 years, there was only really two major changes. That, and then in the 70s, which we'll get to, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, after many years of petitioning and promoting, was promoted to first growth. So there's the angry mob. So this is there were some.
That's a very politically correct way to address the way he got elevated. I appreciate political savvy there.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about the Baron as we get there, but yes, there were some. Again, I imagine that when you get down to the third, fourth, and fifth gross is where there may have been some disgruntled chateau owners as well, because as you said, it's shades of gray. But and this wasn't intended to be for 160 years or what we're going on now. This was for the exposition. This was a ranking for the exposition to explain to the world that this is what their best wines were. And I believe some other angry mob people might have been in other regions, because this was really all in the Médoc, with the exception of Aubryon was the one exception in the first gross there. Everything else is from the Médoc. Grave had been established before the Médoc, as we've talked about in past webinars. Cheval Blanc in Saint-Emilion was already established and had a great reputation. We talked about if you remember, when we did Frontenac was a much more prestigious appellation at that time. So there were some chateaus there that were, very good. And really, it was not just a ranking of the best wines of Bordeaux. It was the ones that were most commercially relevant. And that's something we still talk about today, Ron, right? We still talk about commercially relevant wines. When we talk about in our everyday business, some wines just aren't as commercially relevant as others. So this was really a commercial show intended to increase trade. So you wouldn't necessarily want to promote a chateau that was hard to get to market, that wasn't, would be, hard to ship. And had this been done at a different time, maybe the classification, well, I would assume the classification would look very different. It would include more of Bordeaux. Certainly, if it was going to be redone, which we can talk about if that's ever going to happen later, but if it was ever going to be redone, I would assume that it would be a much wider net and capture a lot more chateau.
Highly likely. I feel like this is a lesson from 1855 that is pointing us to the world that we live in now, right? Where something meant for a very temporary existence becomes permanent, i.e. your experiences on social media, right? You put up the list on social media and all of a sudden it's permanent and it never goes away from your record, no matter where you put it in. And this very temporary assessment of Bordeaux became a permanent and binding set of regulations that is like it's a moral lesson to each one of us. So be careful what you put out in the public, regardless of your own intentions. It might be used for other intentions.
Yes, and can you imagine social media back then? I would imagine that many of the Courtiers, there would be tweets since deleted.
Yes. No, I never said that. I never said that. Look, it's not my feed. Oh well.
We have a screenshot.
Yeah, we have a screenshot of your feed. Yeah, that's thankfully, social media doesn't actually have pitchforks, but I think its results are more painful.
There are definitely figurative pitchforks on social media. So talking about social media, what a promotional genius this man was. So before 1973, this is the quote: I can't be the first. I don't want the second. I remain Mouton. I am above. In some ways, I think he's saying I'm above the classification. I'm Mouton. I don't need your classification. And it's sort of, well, you do, because you want to be at first growth, right? And many years of petitioning, and apparently I didn't hear about this until I did my research either. There was in the 1950s there was a Club des Cinq, the famous five, which is the 5 first growths, and Mouton was removed after in the 1950s, and I don't know the circumstances why, but that redoubled his efforts to be included in the first growths, because this Club des Cinq sounds like it was a temporary thing, but as you just said, this 1855 classification had a little more legs than that, and is still around today. So he realized I can't be subject to the vagaries of whatever modern whims are. I need to be in this classification. So after many years of petitioning, as of the 1973 vintage, was you can see it right there in the label: Premier Cru Classé. I was the first, I was the second, but I remain Mouton. So again, asserting that the wine was always what it was. You can call it first, you can call it second, but it was always Mouton. And this was in homage to Picasso, who passed away that year as well. So very famous label. And as a side note, if you're not aware, that Mouton Rothschild, again, champion promoter, always had some really amazing labels and had top artists of the time design the labels. So, and they're collectors, not collectors items. They're probably like collecting art, right, Ron? You could bid on them just the way you would bid on an art piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the wines are certainly more valuable for the artist who did the label than the vintage that they represent, just by the nature of vintage vagary. But this is certainly one of those. If you still have 1973 laying around, it definitely has a lot more worth than the vintage, just by nature of
Yes.
the elevation of the wine that year and the Picasso label. I've never held a 73 personally. I've only seen it in pictures. So yeah, Mouton, he was something, Baron de Rothschild. He knew what he wanted, and he lived into the idea of you can only say no for so long. I will continue to ask, and you will eventually give in. It's a principle. It goes all the way back to some teachings from 2,000 plus years ago. It's like, he was the original squeaky wheel, and boy was he squeaky.
Yes. Every day he woke up and said, "What can I do today to promote my chateau?
And what can I do today to change the classification?" And I think this is a lesson in that world of, like, my daughter ran a race last weekend, and they came in second. And I said, oh, and I saw the times, and I said, thank goodness that you didn't come in second by like a minute. It was like a 30-minute difference. It was a 24-hour running race. And because if you came in by a couple of minutes, you'd have like these feelings of regret. And if I had only not quite been so delicate when I ran that trail that one time, kind of thing. Whereas, he was immediately given this ammunition when he was told, or the predecessor was told in 1855, that you were the best of the seconds. And you're like, well, what shade of gray got me to second, right? So he had ammunition from the very beginning.
Yeah, I know you. That's why I'm always amazed at, like, professional or world championship or Olympic downhill skiing. The difference between like the first three is 2 milliseconds, and that's like, if you just hit a couple of extra flakes of snow, that's the difference. It's a little easier to swallow if there's a big gap between you and the next person. But I wanted to ask you this, Ron. So surely he wasn't the only chateau owner of a promotional bent, but he was the only one to successfully petition for an upgrade. Does that mean to you that really the quality was there and they always deserved to be in first growth, and that everybody else well, I mean, we'll get in and talk about super seconds and all that stuff in a minute, but you can't talk your way into the first growth. It's certainly his promotional genius and his persistence were factors, but if the wine wasn't there, I don't think it would have happened. What do you think?
It's such a difficult thing to evaluate, in my opinion. I've had the luxury of having quite a few vintages of Mouton through the years, through the generosity of others who collect it, right? And it's always been a different style, at least in the modern era, like 1950s forward. It's always been a different style than Lafite or Latour. A little flashier, a little more oak, a little more, I guess, for lack of a better description, sex appeal and youth, so to speak. It's very kind of a sensual feeling wine. And I never doubt its quality, right? The wine's always great. And I really think his argument probably was driven by my previous comments, that you said I was the best of the seconds, and I say I belong with you, and here's my property, and here's the prices I've been getting, and here's the reviews I've been getting, and here's what everybody thinks about the wine. And he had plenty of ammunition to ask. I think then the rest of the story is like, but what about now? Like, what about what's going on now? Does it still apply? And I think we should talk about that later.
Yeah, because there's a lot to discuss. So I'm going to start some people thinking on this.
Yeah, so let's encourage everybody. All right.
Yes, so get your
Mario sharing
fingers out.
Yeah,
because there's so much to unwrap here. One is that it is the chateau itself that is classified, not the vineyard. And vineyards change hands, and they have over the course since the classification. So if I am a third growth and you're a second growth, Ron, I buy your vineyard, that vineyard's now a third growth, or vice versa. If I'm a second growth and I buy your vineyard, it just got upgraded to second growth. So I remember asking master of wine once, sort of an expert in the area, what does that say about the notion of terroir? And they said, well, Bordeaux's never really been about terroir, has it? It's been about, branding. And I thought, well, okay. But then I posed that to another Bordeaux expert, and they said, well, I understand that point of view, but they have made, first of all, it doesn't happen very often where a higher ranked chateau buys a lower ranked vineyard and then it's promoted. It doesn't happen too often. And when it does, it's normally those vineyards are designated for second wines, not the flagship wine of the chateau, not the one that's actually, considered the classified growth. And they have made a concerted effort, and I hope that I hammered this home throughout the past webinars. They have really made an effort to emphasize terroir in Bordeaux as a whole, not just in the Médoc. So they're much more, they're more terroir centric than ever before. Maybe not as much as other regions, certainly not as much as like Burgundy and stuff like that, but more than they ever have been before, and emphasizing their terroir, their house style. So that's still a good question. What does that say about the notion of terroir if you can change your classification just with a purchase? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ron?
I think you covered it pretty well. The reality is that regardless of how much the Bordelais have promoted the idea of terroir, it is a brand-driven region. And I think that they are maintaining their ethics overall with purchasing vineyards and using it for second wines instead of first wines. And they also have a reputation to protect, right? So if they feel like they're going to put their brand reputation at risk by doing something, they're going to think twice about that, because that's dollars, right? We pay what we pay for these wines based on brand reputation, because that drives demand in the marketplace. And if you put that at risk, watering down your brand, so to speak, then all of a sudden you have bigger problems than whether or not you have enough property or what have you. So I'm sure there are those who are combining lesser vineyards into what are supposed to be greater wines and not telling us. But if the wine in the end is just as great as it's always been, then why do we care?
Right. Good
Yeah.
point.
All right, let's discuss.
Yeah. So here's some, so I just, any questions are valid. So anyone wants to make a point or ask a question or suggest a point of discussion, please do. But I just had some sort of, I wouldn't call them icebreakers, but thought provokers. Is that a term? Is this still valid? It's still around today, going on almost 160 years. Is it still a classification that should be in place? And if so, should it be revised? Because we have chateaus, we call them the super seconds, that are often thought of as just as good as the first growths. We have chateaus from other growths that certainly stand out within their class, that could be considered higher. We definitely have on the right bank some first growth quality chateau on the right bank that should be possibly considered. And is this classification set in stone? Is it something that we should keep, throw it out with the bathwater, or start over, or revise? What are your thoughts, everybody, and what are your thoughts, Ron?
Yeah, so let's start with Mario's comment. He says it's very interesting how the upper class, which would have been these chateaus, no doubt about it, felt at the time that it wasn't enough to make great wines. They needed to have ratings, in this case, the classification, and we'll deal with that in a second, to be considered the best officially. And the reality is we still do. Anybody heard of Robert Parker or the Wine Enthusiast or anybody else, right? And I guess my comment to that, Mario, is we can't actually be assured that the upper class owners of these chateaux felt like the classification was necessary. It just got thrust upon them because of the fair. But There was a famous quote from Rahm Emanuel not too terribly many years ago that said, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So, they've made the most of something thrust upon them by saying, well, yeah, we can use this to our advantage. And yes, I think that it has been true of all wine regions that outside opinions in the end are extremely valuable to those whom they praise. That's true still about Burgundy and Bordeaux. And if you want to drive the price of a wine, you need somebody else to tell somebody else that it's fabulous, because the winery is always going to tell you the wine's fabulous. How is that valid, right? We made it. When you have a third party opinion that you can rely on. And in the modern world, wine is so much larger than it was in 1855. I mean, so many more places making great wine, and the consumer today is so lost to decide amongst that array of wines that are available out there, what should I drink? What's going to be the wine for my party tonight? I have great empathy for them, because I walk into places like Total Wine occasionally to buy wine, and I'm overwhelmed. And this is my profession. If anybody shouldn't be overwhelmed in Total Wine, it's me. But I'm just like, how does anybody decide to buy anything in this place? And so on the specific, is it valid, TJ? I think it depends on which perspective you take. If you walk down the path that terroir really exists in Bordeaux, and from the purest sense that most of these properties are still pretty much the same, in the core wine location is the same, then maybe it is still valid, because accidentally they came up with, these are the best places to plant these Bordeaux style varietals and make great wines, and these chateaux happen to own that land, and that's just the way it is. I don't think it is a true predictor of quality in the modern world, because there are so many other things that have changed from 1855, from climate to technique to stylistic preference and everything else. And so I think that's where you see the rise of the super seconds and the overachieving fifths, right? Where these wines are amazing, long-lived. They'll because this is written in stone, it will not happen in our lifetimes, at least, that their reputation and prices will exceed those of the first growths. There'll have to be a major change in the marketplace for that.
Yeah, two things. I was thinking of it. I imagine that somewhere in the classifications, because you said it wasn't the winery I was looking for. It wasn't. It was for the exposition, and it was really based on the prices that these wines commanded. It wasn't set down like, again, they didn't have a blind tasting, and objectively decide which were the best. This was these sell the best. People pay the most for these, so that's what we're gonna rank them. Does that translate to quality? That's a philosophical question that I'm going to come to. But I imagine some winery owners, some chateau owners might have been pleasantly surprised with their ranking. They might have gotten third and say, "Wow, I always thought this guy down in 4 was better than me, but that's cool. I'll take that." And I'm sure some people were upset too. Probably more of the latter. But it kind of makes me think, Ron, about when people complain about how much money professional athletes are making. They get signed to a $130 million contract, outrageous money. But if the market couldn't make money off of that, they wouldn't make that money. So there's a market for it, right? So does that, and certainly now, I can't drink first growths. I can't drink many second growths. Third growths are a luxury sometimes. And people collect them, they become a commodity. Mm-hmm. Does the price that people are willing to pay for something, is there a connection to quality? I know we're getting on to philosophical.
Well, there is a connection to quality in that it gives the producer greater resources to maintain quality, reinvest in property and vineyards, and hire the best people to do things and stuff like that. But, no. In the end, once you get to a certain level of quality, and let's clarify, all of the 1855 classification of wine is a luxury to consume. All of them. They're all wonderful wines. So once you get to that wonderful wine status, after that, it is supply and demand completely, right? If all of a sudden the world decided that Mouton was not really a first growth, and that they really agreed with the first classification of it and just decided they're going to stop buying it in favor of the other wines until the prices go down, eventually the price would have to go down. You know, the Mouton family wouldn't like it, but they can't just sit on the wine either. So there is that reality. It is possible. And that boils down to something that Paul just mentioned. And that is that, you know, so often we're talking about branding more than what critics say, right? There are wines out there in the market today that sell like gangbusters that the critics don't really love. And there are wines out there that critics love that don't sell gangbusters because they're not the branding approach that people are looking for. But why don't we move on to the next topic?
So should it be revised, Ron? If you were in charge and they said, okay, whatever you decide, Ron, we'll do, would you revise it?
Before I revised it, I would just eliminate it. I would go to the Pomerol model, because revising it just means a never-ending series of lawsuits from anyone that gets demoted.
Yeah. That's why it'll probably never be revised.
Yeah, it'll probably never be revised because the government doesn't want to have to invest that many millions of dollars to defend its decisions. And it is a governmental issue at this point. I mean, just look at what's happened with the Saint-Emilion classification revisions, even though they were intended to be revised, right?
That was the point. Yeah, they were like, we're going to revise these every 10 years. And that's been a huge can of worms.
So I guess, no, I wouldn't revise it because in the end now, the market drives it as much as the classification. And I would love to see it get to a point where the market drives it entirely, because I'm referring back to your comment about, elite athletes and superstars making crazy money. I have no problem with that. They have a unique set of skills that they will only be able to use for a limited amount of time. And through their imagery and presence in that field, all kinds of people are making lots of money about that, right? And so, I believe that you should have an unlimited ability to be paid for your talents. After that, I think what boils down to, if you want to start talking about conscience, it's not how much money you make, it's what you do with your money after you make it, right? And so that's a whole nother discussion. But in this case, I would love for it to just be removed and let the market drive.
Well, that makes me think about our next question, sort of segues right in. Do consumers care? Who cares about this classification? Certainly the Chateau owners have a vested interest, and the whole Bordeaux system, La Place, they're interweaved with the classifications, not just this one, but all throughout Bordeaux. So I would assume they care very much. At what level at all do consumers care? What are your thoughts?
I think it's the limited part of the consumer base that cares. And these are the people who can actually justify spending the money required to buy classified growth Bordeaux. They care because the dollars they're spending are relative to that classification. What I think is interesting is the end result of the classification was an increase in prices of the wines in the classification to a level that they are no longer entertainable for the majority of people who drink wine regularly, right? These are wines that at best, for most of us, are a luxury on a special occasion. And that kind of removes the relevance of the 1855 classification. And I'll give this example. I've spent the better part of the last 15 years in front of audiences of trade professionals, trying to get them beginning points of, do you want to be a professional sommelier? Here's what it takes. Here's the information you need. And over that time period, I saw a significant decrease in knowledge of the basics of Bordeaux in that audience. And I attribute that directly to the result of the price increases around the 1855 classifications and their similars. Because you're basically taking those wines out of the relevance of everyday wine sale. Therefore, people find those facts less important. People could tell me weird facts about like Jura and couldn't name 3-second growths. Well, of course I can't name 3-second growths. I've never put my hand on a bottle of second growth Bordeaux, much less sold it to one of my customers. So that's, I think, is what really is driving this do consumers care issue is, it's like, do I care that people make Ferraris? Yeah, but am I going to drive a Ferrari? No. So, it might drive by me on the street one day and I recognize the emblem, but that's about as close as I'm going to get. So I think that there's a certain reality there, but that won't change even if the classification went away tomorrow, right, DJ? The value of these wines already exists. So, at that point, you're talking about brand, what opportunity cost to the consumer is just too high in most cases to care.
Yeah, I remember talking with a former Winebow employee in Connecticut, was very wine knowledgeable, and he had gone to Yale in the late 60s and I believe worked at a wine shop while he was in college. And that's how he fell in love with wine. And you could buy, Cru Classé Bordeaux. You could buy Premier Cru Burgundy, Grand Cru Burgundy even for not that much money. I don't think it was an everyday thing, but it was affordable. It was attainable. And then, yeah, you're right. It became unattainable for many. And yeah, a lot of the Somme community stopped caring, and you stopped seeing it in restaurants, even on wine lists. And that's why Bordeaux made a very concerted effort in the US to get people turned back on in the industry to Bordeaux, because it's a fantastic wine region. And they're not, as we've discussed in past webinars, it's not all about the class growths. There's so much else out there to enjoy. So
because the classified growths became the face of Bordeaux when they were affordable, like, oh, if I'm going to drink Bordeaux, I'm going to drink these, right? Because I can buy it for $5 instead of $3. And that's real, right? Like in the 1970s, you could buy classified growth Bordeaux in the under $10 range if you were buying the right one, which is crazy. Now, obviously, there's a cost of living change there, right? But still, we're not talking about anywhere near the cost of living exchange of what it costs now.
Right.
And everything changed in 1982. Everything changed, and it's never going back unless there's some sort of
what was
disaster.
About 1982?
1982 was the beginning of Robert Parker's reign on Bordeaux.
Yep.
100 point wines, 100 point
amazing
vintage.
Influence from that one individual. You had talked in our chat before. I didn't have a screen for it, but it's kind of important because we have a lot of industry people here. How can we use in our business? How can we use the classification, not just this classification, but any of the classification?
Well, first of all, I would tell you in the restaurant industry, let's start there because that's my specialty, right? Mm-hmm. You should not think you cannot sell these wines. You can sell these wines. You can sell classified growth wines in restaurants. You're not going to sell them in every restaurant, but if you're careful about which ones you pick, you can feature them alongside of your expensive New World wines as an alternate option for the people who are willing to spend a couple $100 on a bottle of wine. And don't fool yourself. Those people show up in lots of kinds of restaurants, not just expensive restaurants. And don't accidentally leave money on the table because you undersell your customers. So keep that in mind. The other thing I think that we can do in retail is a careful use of the 1855 classification in your wine cellar options, right? If you're selling Napa Valley Cab at $175 a bottle in your retail establishment, why wouldn't you have a couple of selections from the 1855 classification? Because it's an opportunity to expand your customer's palate, and they'll feel similarly that they're buying luxury goods, just like the highly touted wines of Napa. And to me, that boils down to how you organize your store, right? If you put like luxury Cabernet all in one place, then you can sell luxury Napa next to luxury Bordeaux, next to luxury Bulgari, next to luxury South America, specifically, elevated Chilean wines and in particular. So I guess that's how I would use it. We definitely need to stop shying away from it entirely out of fear of cost and sales. That people are still consuming these wines.
Mm-hmm.
Mario remembers in 1989, you could buy Mouton Rothschild in Bay Ridge, North Carolina, New York, for $45 a bottle. Now it's $45 an ounce.
Yeah, at least. Wow. So that's not even that. Well, it is a long time ago now, but it's
no, that was 89.
In the late 60s.
But remember, TJ, that's 89. That's 7 years past the 82 vintage.
Right.
And 89 was a highly regarded vintage. It was another 82. So it had only gone up, it had probably gone up 300% to get to $45.
So was it perhaps the rise of the internet and that spurred investment and turned into much more of a commodity?
It was a combination of the new rating system, the rise of Robert Parker, and the rise of the Hong Kong and Chinese wine market.
Sure. Yeah,
It was mostly the Chinese market, including Hong Kong, that drove the prices through the roof, because it got to a point where the collectors there valued these wines for gifting and status symbol at a level that they didn't care what they had to pay, because they had so much money, it didn't matter. And literally people had warehouses full of Bordeaux just because they had it. It was crazy. And it's still crazy. Although I suppose now with the communist takeover of Hong Kong, things may change in that direction because their whole existence is going to be altered, but we'll see. Don't know yet.
Yeah, well, that whole gifting practice was outlawed not too many years ago, right? So that had a big effect, a chilling effect on luxury goods in general, I think, wine and spirits and other things.
Can you imagine having the luxury of buying 89 Mouton for $45? And there were probably people going, "Oh, I'm not going to pay that. That's ridiculous."
I know, $45. Not me, but the $175 Napa cab isn't all that rare in a retail setting, right? But you'd be hard pressed to find a classified growth.
I was selling 1989 Leo Velasquez on my restaurant wine list in 1997. No, I guess it was, I'm sorry, it was 1993 Leo Velasquez, which was a way overlooked wine. I had it on my menu in a restaurant at restaurant markups for $150 in 1996. 97. You can't, that's not even wholesale cost on that bottle now.
Right. Yeah.
I'm so old.
The wineCellarInsider.com, great website. I've talked about it before. Really a great source of background information here, stuff that you haven't read about or heard about before about the 1855 classification. And Bordeaux.com is, your go-to website for all things Bordeaux. And there are more classifications to cover, Ron. This was a biggie and deserved its own episode. So we got that out of the way, but we're going to cover the rest of the classifications in the next episode, which will be in 2 weeks on Tuesday, September 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be into officially fall at that point. Autumn will be, what's it, the 21st, something like that?
Yes.
So wear a sweater if weather dictates, and we hope to see you then. And Ron, do we have a pre-shift coming up soon?
Pre-shift this week coming up is a skip week, so we will have pre-shift on October 5th, and it's the episode on sparkling wine strategies, which everyone, the whole world should be tuning in for sparkling wine strategies.
Yes.
But that's just my humble addiction to sparkling wine.
Summer's my favorite season, although I do like the fall, but summer's my favorite season. But as a consolation, there's a strong correlation with me that as the fall weather starts approaching, I start thinking of bubbles. There's some sort of Pavlovian response, I think, as we get.
Yeah, I start thinking of bubbles when I wake up right after my first cup of coffee. I'm like, when do I get to have bubbles this week?
So join
Friday.
us September 28th and then October 5th. And as always, you can watch previous episodes of both shows, the Bordeaux Show and Pre-Shift, on the Winebow YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time.